Good morning. This is Dick Black, and you're at Focus on the News. Today is Washington's birthday, or President's Day, as it's known some places. And so this is Monday, February 19th, 2024. We're going to talk about a tremendous battle that has just been fought, the battle for Avdiivka, which is near the Donbass, and it has been captured by the Russians, and today we've got Jim Jatras, who is a good friend of ours and a tremendous expert on foreign affairs, and particularly the affairs associated with Russia. His family has a lot of connections to Serbia and sort of the whole undertaking in that area of the world. So Jim, it's good to have you with us, and we're going to ask the question of really, what does the fall of Avdiivka and the retreat of the Ukrainian army mean for the war? Does it mean that the war is lost, or what is it? What's its impact on the direction that the war will take from here on?
Well, Senator, it's thank you again for having me on the show. It's always a privilege. In terms of the fall of Avdiivka, I think there are a few things that are relevant. One, let's remember that this is the area where the Kiev forces have been shelling the Donbass ever since 2014, for 10 years now. So you would have thought that this would have been a Russian priority from the beginning of the conflict in order to relieve Donbass or Donetsk city from this threat that's actually taken the lives of many civilians. But I guess in terms of their overall strategy, that they're just now getting around to it. And it was a very fortified area. It's interesting to me that the new General Syrsky, who's taken over as the commander of the Ukrainian forces, who has a reputation of what do they call them? The butcher of Bakhmut, the idea that he's more than willing to feed more and more men into the meat grinder, on this occasion chose to withdraw their forces rather than make a stand like they did in Mariupol and Bakhmut. So I don't know what this indicates in terms of the overall Ukrainian strategy at this point to shift over to the defensive. The real question, though, is even if they shift over to the defensive, where's the next place, the next line where they can make a stand? There's no obvious place moving west from Avdiivka where they can establish a secure line, especially given how thin they are in manpower, machinery, and especially ammunition. I've seen reports that, for example, there have been fewer and fewer Russian strikes on Ukrainian artillery for the simple reason that you can't locate the artillery unless they're firing, and they're not firing because they don't have the ammunition. So with all this talk now about whether or not we're going to supply more money to Ukraine, the question is, what are they going to do with more money? Because they can't manufacture manpower out of thin air with more money. They can't manufacture more ammunition out of thin air if the production capacity just isn't there. So at this point, I think we are nearing a real critical juncture in this conflict where we see what the next step is from Ukraine and their Western backers, and whether they can come up with a viable defensive strategy.
Jim, you raise a very important point for people who closely follow the war. They're looking at maps that there are several different places. The Institute for Study of War publishes maps and others, but the shortfall of the maps is that the maps are flat. They're two-dimensional, and terrain is three-dimensional. And what makes this portion of Ukraine that has been captured by Russia so important is the terrain. The terrain is very rugged. It's mountainous. It's hilly. There are very vital rivers and that sort of thing. And you know, I've followed the war in Syria since literally before it began, because what got me so fascinated was I was curious why we were attacking Libya, which was very anti-terrorist and actually a pro-American country, and then we attacked them. Well, the reason was that we needed there were a couple of reasons, but one big one was we needed their arsenal of weapons shipped over to the border of Turkey to then send into the Al-Qaeda linked terrorists in Syria so that we could overthrow the government there. But I watched that war play out, and one of the things that became apparent to me is that urban combat is a very specialized type of battle. Very bloody, tremendous casualties. It's slow moving. You don't have rapid shifts within these places. And I watched the Great Battle of Aleppo City, which is the second largest city in Syria, and it went on for years and years, and tremendously bloody battle on both sides. And but those great battles tend to reach a point where something happens that begins to shift the balance of power, and then at that point things begin to move faster until there is a collapse on one side. And that's what happened to in the Battle of Aleppo, where, you know, several years into it, the Russians joined the fray, and they added their air power. Now, not ground forces, but they added some air power, and there was sort of the first Iranian support that came in. But basically, it had been Hezbollah and Syria fighting this battle for years. And anyway, once it happened, there was the great collapse of ISIS and Al Qaeda, and the Syrian army began to surge forward. And once they started that surge, it just went on and on until the entire country would have been cleared by the Syrian army with the help of Iran, which became increasingly prominent. And but the United States jumped in at a critical moment, went into the northern part of Syria, and after we defeated ISIS, we helped to defeat ISIS in northern Syria. Then we raced the Syrian army for control of the area, fought with them in some instances, and seized control of it. But in any event, yeah, what I see going on with this is with Avdiivka, this war, really the battle for Avdiivka has raged since 2014. And now Americans don't realize that Russia didn't start a war. Russia just entered a war that had a fairly major war that had been going on since 2014. And but this battle for Avdiivka just is a very, very lengthy struggle that was finally won. And you know, with these types of things, you look at the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and it was supposed to be the spring, and then it became the summer counteroffensive. It was just a bloody disaster. I mean, it was an absolute rout for the Ukrainian army. They fought bravely, courageously, but they were just butchered. I shouldn't say it was a rout, because they didn't just simply flee, but they were butchered, and they lost tremendous numbers of casualties, and that weakened them everywhere. And it's somewhat reminiscent of what happened to the South at Gettysburg. What happened is that in Gettysburg, the North had been attacking the South, and Robert E. Lee attacked to the North. He was trying to win a political victory. Gettysburg was the big thrust northward, and up in Pennsylvania, the Confederate forces were stopped. They were blocked by the Union. It's interesting. If you look at, I looked at the casualties, North and South, in the battle for Gettysburg. The North suffered 23,000 casualties. The South, 28,000 casualties. So you look at it and you think this is probably the most memorable victory for the North in the entire war. And yet, okay, 23,000, 28,000 doesn't seem that dramatic a difference. But the difference is that the population of the North was more than triple that of the South, very similar to the ratio that we have between Russia and Ukraine. And so when the South lost an equal, or in this case, a somewhat larger number of casualties, the impact was 3 or 4 times as large as it was in the North. So we're seeing something similar, where there certainly are a lot of casualties on both sides. Russia is losing a lot of men, just as Ukraine is. But the fact is that if you've got triple the number of men to draw from, every time you lose one and the other side loses one, that other side is much worse off than you are, because you just got more people to join the fray. So we had the Battle of Bakhmut, which was a great Russian victory, very similar to Avdiivka, apparently not as large as Avdiivka in terms of casualties and so forth. But after the initial victories that Ukraine was able to score, we see them do their great counteroffensive, which was blocked, and terrible loss for Ukraine. And now we see them losing, and we see the entire front, which is about 600 miles long. All along the front, we see the Russians beginning to move forward, not in some dramatic, surge forward, but everywhere. It's they just are eating away. So it's hard to say what happens next. Do they somehow manage to shore up their lines and stop the Russians, or do things start to come unraveled, which they will sooner or later? It's a question of when.
That's right, and the parallels are striking in some cases with regard to the American Civil War, and I think that's one reason why people are misreading the situation in Ukraine, saying, "Oh, look, there's a stalemate. The Russians haven't been able to seize more ground." When, remember, what are the 2 planks of the Russian policy? Demilitarization and denazification. With regard to the first one, their goal has not been up to this point to say we're going to seize territory. We're going to take Kharkov. We're going to take Odessa. Even rather to pull back, as they did early in the war, from Kiev and other areas where they were, trying to make a political point, find a negotiation. Of course, nobody was willing to negotiate. But the real goal now militarily for some time has been destroy the Ukrainian forces, demilitarize Ukraine. And I think that's what we're really seeing right now, is that I think your comparison on the American Civil War is right. But let's keep in mind it's even more lopsided than it was at the beginning of the war. Ukraine may have had, well, down from 40, maybe even 35 million people when the conflict began. I'd be surprised if there are 20 million people now left in the areas controlled by Kiev, whereas the Russian population is still, approaching 150 million people. And even more so in the American Civil War. As you point out at Gettysburg, the Confederates, in terms of loss of manpower, actually got the worst side of that in raw numbers. As we see later in the war, especially toward the end when Lee's army was destroyed, Grant was losing more men than Lee was, but he could replace them and Lee could not. And it's even more lopsided in this case, especially when we consider that the rate of fire, the fact that the Russians can remember, most of the deaths on the battlefield in Ukraine are from artillery, drones, other remote weapons, and the Russians are out shooting them like 7, 8, 9, 10 to 1, with the casualties that are commensurate with that. So this is just bleeding Ukraine white. That's the demilitarization part. Switch over now to the denazification part, that you've got this chaos now that we're increasingly seeing in Kiev, where Zelensky has removed General Zaluzhny. It's pretty clear that Zaluzhny is not out of the picture. He's still got strong support from former President Poroshenko and also from the Banderist and Pravy Sector, Azov Battalion, all the extremist nationalist forces in Kiev. Who's propping up Zelensky? His foreign sponsors, CIA, MI6. He's basically an actor being supported by outside forces. This is a very unstable situation in Ukraine, and so right at the center of the regime in Kiev. So both on the battlefront and in Kiev, things are not looking good for Kiev. And I think the real question is, what will the Russians do next? Will they press their advantage until something cracks and they can win a final victory, maybe comparable to what happened when Lee's army was finally defeated? When Lee surrendered, he didn't get permission from Jeff Davis to do that. Lee surrendered his army. That was effectively the end of the war, and that there was no negotiated solution at that point. And is that what the Russians will press for? Or will they, as Putin indicated in his interview with Tucker Carlson, will they look for some other kind of political deal here in a negotiation? And, I'm not sure how that would work out based on previous promises made by the Western powers that were simply not kept.
The situation in Kiev is kind of dicey for Zelensky, isn't it? Because he has removed General Zaluzhny, who was the overall commander of Ukrainian forces. But not only did he remove him, but he's removed, I don't know what, six or eight. Mm-hmm. Basically, the entire top chain of command has been replaced, and the general who's now in charge, Siersky, is something like that. Anyway, he is very unpopular because of the way that Ukrainians felt he mismanaged the Battle of Bakhmut by leaving troops in there long after he should have, when they had lost all of their terrain, their tactical advantages, and they were being hemmed in, and he allowed them to just simply be killed off with no particular gain in mind. So I think that's the reason that they've changed their strategy now, is that the same general is now, he's got in his mind, okay, I really got burned by the public on that, so I'm not going to let that happen again. But in fact, I picked up on something that said that when General Syrski issued his order to retreat, it was long after the retreat had begun, and the units in Avdiivka simply pulled up stakes and started hightailing it out of there. And so General Syrski then issued the order to retreat a day after the troops had begun to retreat.
Yeah.
So I guess he figured, well, I'm going to take credit for having done this rather than make it look like they just sort of broke and ran. I don't get the impression that they were truly routed. I mean, there were places obviously where, if you're caught and you're the last guy, you're going to take off running. So the Ukrainians are very, very courageous people, but Zelensky he's getting into a more politically dicey situation where this whole chain of command has shifted. And he has started to lose popularity. He's not nearly as popular as the general he relieved, General Zaluzny, but I think after this defeat, I think we'll see his popularity waning rather quickly. Now he tries to stay popular within the capital city of Kiev because he's sort of given them a break from all of the drafts and so forth, the conscription of all the people who are being sent to the front line. Every once in a while, a video surfaces of the young men in Kiev living it up, living the high life, walking, with ladies arm in arm or men arm in arm, whatever they do there, and sipping their cocktails in the evening, listening to rock music. And the war is somewhere else for a lot of the young men in Kiev, but not for the people out in the smaller towns and cities of Ukraine who have been drafted mercilessly into the fray. But when you talk about the aftermath of the fall of Avdiivka, I remember in the Army War College, one of the things that they emphasized in our studies was how frequently wars were won or lost on the issue of whether the force that prevails in a battle pursues the enemy and takes full advantage of its victory. And of course, your ability to pursue depends on a lot of different things, including the willingness of the other side to resist. And so it's hard to say how much the Russians can gain here. But as you mentioned, they've lost their terrain advantage now. Instead of fighting from a fortified city with hills and water obstacles, suddenly they're now out on the flat plains where they're exposed to aircraft, to Russian aircraft, and that kind of thing.
Well, that's right. And in fact, what you mentioned about the pursuing the defeated enemy, people will still debate forever whether Meade could have pursued Lee after Gettysburg and destroyed the Army of Virginia, trapped it on the wrong side of the Potomac, and ended the war much earlier if they had been able to do that. I don't know if that was military feasible, or whether he just didn't do it because he was too cautious, perhaps. But in any case, yeah, you see these discussions now is if Ukraine does shift over to a strategy of active defense. Some people compare that to what the German army did starting in 1943 as the Soviets were going on the offensive then after Stalingrad, whether such a defense will be viable and whether there's any other conceivable line before they get to the Dnieper River. And then, of course, even that presents its own problems because, well, the Russians have ways they can come down from the north on the west side of the Dnieper River, so even the river may not be much of a defensive line. So there are a lot of variables here, but I think we're now getting to the point where the real questions are going to be less and less what's militarily feasible for the Russians and more politically, what do they want to do? Do they want to impose a settlement through military means, essentially what the North did during the Civil War, or do they want to float some kind of a political settlement or expect the other side to float a political settlement? And if you look at the kind of people we have talking from the Western governments, there seems to be no realistic assessment of how things are going on in the ground in Ukraine. They still talk as though the Ukrainians can still, well, if they can hold out defensively through 2024, and by then we'll have cranked up our defense production, we'll be putting new military plants in Ukraine, and they'll be getting the F-16s, and they can go back on the offensive in 2025. I mean, as far as I can tell, this is all totally delusional. What do you think, Senator?
It's interesting. I look at all of the major newspapers, and while the New York Times did some pretty good reporting on the Battle of Avdiivka, there was little reported about the fall of Avdiivka in other major media outlets. They gave a lot of attention to the death of the political dissident over there in prison, and little trivial things like that really have no global impact, and they ignored something that is a very, very significant defeat for Ukraine. Something had the shoe been on the other foot, had Ukraine won a victory and defeated Russia at Avdiivka, they would have been working all night long to put stories all through the newspapers. But I don't know that they know exactly what to say about it at this point. It seems that at some point there will be a peace. I see absolutely no possibility that Russia gives up any of the lands that it's captured so far. Do you have a different view on that?
No. I not only that. I mean, remember besides Crimea, there are 4 oblasts that Russia now considers to be Russian territory, and as far as I know, none of the 4 is completely under Russian control. There are still areas of each of those oblasts that are still controlled by Kiev's forces. So I think at the very, very, very least, they would not settle for anything less than that. And frankly, I don't see how they end this war from Moscow's point of view without at least taking Kharkov and Odessa and everything in between. And again, I don't know if they would do this by raising some sort of political demand and expecting the other side to agree to it, or whether they take another leaf from our American Civil War and demand unconditional surrender. I don't know if they will do that, or whether they're still waiting. And I have to tell you, Senator, I'm a little concerned that, going back to the interview with Tucker Carlson, that Putin still harbors a certain naivete about his Western interlocutors, that at some point they will wake up and smell the coffee and see sweet reason and come to the table and negotiate a reasonable settlement. And I just don't see any prospect of that. but I'm not sure people in Moscow fully realize that that's never going to happen. Okay, and what I don't want to see is, just like when we discussed the situation in the Middle East, some kind of a dynamic where things start to escalate because there are unreal expectations on the Western side, and the Russians don't really fully realize the kind of delusional, irresponsible people they're dealing with. I mean, again, let's look at the Biden administration. As far as I can tell, they only have one goal, and that is to prevent a kind of an Afghanistan-style humiliation in Ukraine that would occur before the election does, because they're only focused on their electoral prospects. They don't give a damn about Ukraine or Russia or the peace of Europe or anything else except how to get past this next election. And that, when you're dealing with people like that, how do people in Moscow come up with any kind of reasonable prognosis or of how they should proceed when you're dealing with kind of people like, Nuland and Blinken and Sullivan and other just irresponsible lightweights?
Yeah, the policy of the Biden administration has been incredibly reckless. The sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline, cutting off Europe's vital access to cheap Russian natural gas, that has kicked away the underpinnings of the entire European economy, and it's done it in a foundational way. It's not one of these economic fluctuations that goes up and down. But basically, it has taken the entire European economy down the elevator a couple of stories and stopped there, and it's not going back up. So we did that. We cut the lifeline to Europe. We sank the Russian flagship, the Moskva. Whether we did it with CIA agents firing or whether there might have been some Ukrainians involved, I don't know. But clearly, that it was our missile that did it, or missiles, so we sent 300 young Russian sailors to the bottom in their flagship. We assisted the targeting of Russia's nuclear triad with Ukrainian drones that would never have sent those drones to attack deep inside of Russia and destroy the bombers that carry nuclear weapons without American okay. And I think there are a number of people within the Biden administration who are willing to provoke Russia to the point where perhaps there would be some sort of a nuclear outbreak and just really insane types of things. The desperation of these people to, pull victory from the jaws of defeat. They're willing to risk all of the American population and all of humanity for their own personal gain. So it's, one other thing I noticed that Denmark, the president of Denmark announced that they would give all of their artillery shells to Ukraine, which certainly tells you something about how serious Europe takes the threat of a Russian attack on Western Europe. I mean, you give up all of your artillery and make yourselves unable to fight, and yet you try to maintain this fiction that somehow Russia is a threat to Western Europe. And I think it just doesn't hold water at this point.
No, that's right. They clearly don't believe their own propaganda when it comes to the so-called Russian threat to the rest of Europe. And if we don't stop in Ukraine, we'll be fighting in Germany and Poland and France or the English channel or whatever it might be. And I think the other thing is on the politics is I wonder where things are going now with the Republicans. I mean, we have, Donald Trump saying that he will stop the war when he becomes president, 24 hours, 48 hours, whatever it is. But again, I think there's a real serious question. Will this thing be over by then, assuming he is able to get to the White House in January of 2025? And in the meantime, it was a very interesting vote in the Senate on this aid bill where they'd stripped out the border protection money. It was only money for Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan, but 2/3 of the Republicans voted against it, and those are Senate Republicans. I think in the House, we've got even more, let's say, an outbreak of realism among the Republicans, and maybe there's some room for hope there.
I think so. Well, we will see. I did notice that after the Battle of Gettysburg and the Civil War, the war continued on for 2 years. So it wasn't as though that loss stopped things immediately. So it's been some time now since the Ukrainian counteroffensive was smashed back. And we're just in these years where there may be some wins on either side of the battlefront, but I doing a little bit of reading on it. They talked about how Ulysses S. Grant, who finally did take firm control over the Union Army. That he had wins and he had losses, but when he had losses, he just kept throwing troops in and just kept grinding away because he had more people. And if he had a lot of Union troops die in battle, he just threw more Union troops in. And I think that's what Ukraine is faced with is that they don't have troops. Russia does have troops. And Russia is willing to use them to achieve victory because this is an existential threat to Russia. And well, Jim, I think we will leave it at this, and I'm sure we'll be talking about future combat. I don't think either of us takes any satisfaction in the death of all of these Ukrainians. I feel as badly for them as I do for the Russians, but I do think that from a global perspective, a NATO victory over Russia would be a very negative thing for the people of our country. I fear that if the globalists eventually were to take control of the entire globe, they're going to fight somebody, and they're just going to turn on us, and they've already started doing that. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Well, my hope is, at least in the short term, that enough Ukrainians start saying, look, enough is enough. We can't go on like this. I understand the pace of surrenders on the front has increased, and at some point, somebody in their military says, we aren't doing this no more. We're going to turn on these people in Kiev that just are squandering their lives like this. And maybe that is the way that this wraps up, hopefully sooner rather than later.
I hope so. Well, thank you very much, Jim, for being with us. This is Dick Black, and appreciate everyone listening. We'll be back with you next Monday. Let's focus on the news. We'll see you then.